Thanks, Daniela, and thank you to Uncle Alan for that welcome to country. So I'll introduce our panellists. First up, we have Judith Ngala Crispin. Judith is a visual artist and poet, a descendant of the Bangarang and Gunakurnai people from the Murray River. Judith's work centres on lost history and dispossession, as well as relationship building with country. Judith's cameraless method of photography incorporates a range of photographic processes. Judith has published a collection of poetry, the Myrbearers, apologies, and a book of images and poems, The Lumen Seed. Judith is a member of the Oculi Collective. She is currently working on her illustrated verse novel, The Dingo's Nocturne. Nick Moyer in the centre. Nick is the chief photographer at the Sydney Morning Herald. Nick has been specialising in climate news events for over 25 years. He's covered major fires, storms, droughts and floods throughout that time, including the Black Christmas fires of 2001, the Canberra fires of 2003, the Millennium Drought, Victorian Black Saturday fires of 2009, Brisbane floods of 2011, the 2017-20 New South Wales drought, 2019-2020 Black Summer, and multiple floods, and the multiple New South Wales floods of 2020 and 2022. Nick has forecasted and led several successful US storm chase expeditions to Tornado Valley in the US, as well as the seasonal task of finding and photographing Australian severe storms. He's been recognised by World Press Photo and the Nikon-Walkley Awards for coverage of these disasters. In his spare time, Nick is also a volunteer firefighter with the New South Wales RFS. Don't know where you find the time.
Just at the expense of my family.
Yes. And lastly, but certainly not least, is Matthew Abbott. Matthew is an Australian documentary photographer who specialises in long-form visual storytelling. Matthew's images have gained international recognition for sensitively depicting some of the major issues of our time. Matt believes that storytelling is most powerful when it is rooted in a close connection to the subjects and a deep understanding of the stories in front of the lens. He's won several prestigious domestic and international photojournalism awards, including 4 Walkley Awards, 3 World Press Photo Awards, including the Global Story of the Year in 2022. Matt is a regular contributor to the New York Times, the Washington Post, and National Geographic. Okay, to start off, can I ask each of you to describe your practice, your processes, how you find or instigate a story, or the inspiration for a project? We might start with Matt.
Yeah, thanks, Dean. So I'm a documentary photographer. Sometimes I say photojournalist, but at the moment, documentary feels more right. I have a sort of a mixed practice. So a part of what I do for my work and income is photojournalism, where I work for mostly international clients, and I enjoy that because they generally have like a larger budgets to work on stories. So a typical assignment for me would be about 5 or 6 days, I'd say on average. And I've sort of tried to make Australia my sort of topic of focus, not just on environmental issues, but also human rights, human interests as well. So quite a range of different topics, I guess. But I also love working on like creative personal projects. And this is a direction I sort of feel like I'm going more down at the moment. And this gives me the time to spend many years potentially on one idea and really explore things thoroughly.
Yeah. Judith?
I'm a fine art photographer, one of those rare artists that actually manages to survive full-time from art. We do exist. And I tend to work on very long-range projects. My last project was a 6-year project, which really looked into the way that we value lives, the fact that we insist that the life of a world leader is worth more than the life of a zebra finch, which is something that I don't think is right, and is a sign of kind of mass psychopathy. And so I've spent 6 years making a lot of images from cadavers, from animals that have died through human intervention in various ways. Climate is one, so a lot of animals that died in the fires, but also a lot of roadkill and yeah. So essentially what I do is work for years and years and years on the one thing, and I'm moving now into more of an area of pestilence, looking at the way that large-scale disasters kill really large amounts of non-human animals.
Right, thank you.
Nick, one thing though is interesting though, how you actually create your prints. I think people should know that.
Yeah, well,
or don't tell them the secret.
It's a secret. No, they're cameraless. But what that means actually, in fact, is that the animal themselves really makes their own picture. So I use old-fashioned darkroom paper, and if you that have been in a darkroom will know that if you take that stuff outside, it starts darkening. And so I put the cadaver down on the page, and then I do some chemistry around that animal, and I leave it to expose for 24 to 50 hours normally, and the decomposition chemistry comes out of the animal, which is of course full of salts, and these chemicals that have wonderful names like putrescence and cadaverescence, and they're the things that smell really bad. They also make really good marks on the page. And then after that, I respectfully bury the animal. So yeah, I don't actually harm the animal, I just arrive during the pause between it dying and being buried.
There's a life after death.
Yeah.
I am more of a nerd, so I kind of like, for me, it's photography is almost a tool to go and experience some of these amazing events. So more and more I've used my study of meteorology and weather maps to be at the right place at the right time. When, for example, for storms, it will be, like for example, this Sunday, there's some instabilities moving. As you guys may have noticed, we've had some northeasterlies moving through. It's quite humid again. That moisture's all moving inland. There's going to be an upper trough come through and cause some storms in the north of the state. So before I volunteered for a RFS strike team, I was planning in storm chasing up around Lightning Ridge, but instead I'll be up there fighting fires and maybe taking a couple of sneaky pictures as well. But essentially it's about, I mean, photography has always been about being at the right place at the right time, and it's you can't be in it for a long time successfully without 99% of that work being at the right place at the right time. And so you've got to use, you can't be one of these lazy journos who sit in the office, the scribblers, the writers, or those fraudsters. We actually have got to be out there on the ground, talking to the people, getting beaten up, getting in arguments, and actually living and experiencing those events. And they can be very challenging, but when you, for example, a storm or even a major fire, you're in the presence of something that's, when they become organised, and I seriously mean that, they will take on their own life. When you hear about a fire saying, you know, it created its own weather, that's kind of the dumb journo way of saying some really, really complex meteorological stuff where you're getting physics becoming really organised, and it's, you know, hot air rising and rotating and wrapping in, and when you get that macro scale sort of stuff going on, all new rules start to come into play. That we don't actually understand yet, which is like really amazing for a person to be on the ground and experiencing it. So for me, it's trying to use my art and photography to be a witness when most of the other people are just either trying to stay alive or fight that fire. Somebody else coming in and having a bit of time to actually observe what's actually going on.
So Nick, I've got one of your pictures up here.
Yeah, super cool, even if I do say so myself. So this is actually Ugara, which got hit 3 years later by like an epic, a flash flood, wiped, destroyed a lot of buildings in the town. So this was January 2020. So that's actually a tornado, which I've managed to confirm later on. But essentially this storm, normally you wouldn't see it because there's so little moisture, but storm formed up over this super dry area. This is the first time, the first parts of when moisture was starting to come back into the system again. So you had some storms. At first I was just expecting some outflow from this storm, but it actually started to become organised, and my spidey senses started going, ooh, and then it actually drove over the top of me, which was pretty cool video. And then as it's gone off, you actually are able to stand back and go, oh, something's going on here that I wasn't actually expecting. So what's cool when you're doing stuff in Western New South Wales is there's no data. There's the half the data that they've got is make believe. Half the there'll be some joker from the local RFS peeing into the water, the rain measuring cup or whatever. It's like, wow, geez, the dew points are high over here unexpectedly. But anyway, it's kind of like you've really got to use your eyes, and then so when we actually go over to the States, we do really well because like we're used to really just looking at the skies rather than the other nerdpocalypse. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
My pleasure.
We're going to move to, this is one of Matt's pictures from his cool Burn series, was it?
Yeah.
Yep.
That's it. Yeah.
Ran in National Geographic.
Yeah.
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 Do you want to just talk to us a bit about that project? Because, I know, as we all know, Indigenous peoples have been managing the land for thousands of years, but from my memory, this is one of the first photographic essays that sort of documented that.
Yeah, so this project was born, I guess, in response to the Black Summer fires. And I had an editor from National Geographic reach out and say, hey, Matt, we liked your work from those fires. We'd like you to, take a whole bunch of time and money and go and research and come back to us with a kind of a response. Like, we want to know something more in depth. So instead of those images that we were making during the fires, that was very much responding, It was like, Nick was there the whole way through it, but it was just day in, day out. Didn't know what was happening the next day after the next,
I did, but I just
You
didn't
did,
tell you.
and Nick would tell us.
No, I didn't.
Drip feed information.
Or if it was going to be good, I wouldn't let you know.
Nick's actually like the wizard
Let
of.
me keep talking.
Anyway, sorry, we'll come back to that. So this was a chance to sort of spend a lot of time. I had about a year to work on this project, and look, I pitched a whole bunch of different ideas, but this was from the very beginning the idea that I was most excited about, and that was about these. This is the Nawadikan people up in Arnhem Land, and they're in sort of West Arnhem, and I'd actually spent. About 13 years earlier, I'd spent a couple of years living there and working there. Right. And so a lot of the people in these images I actually knew, I know quite well. And I had the privilege of being invited on one of their walks 13 years ago, where they were literally just walking through the bush and dropping matches and burning things as they were walking. Kids were doing it. It was very much part of the way of life. And so this was an incredible experience for me at the time. And I've since obviously learnt and since learned that this has been a process that's been carrying on without gaps, without pauses for tens of thousands of years. And so by managing the land and by burning the land at the very specific times, you're able to the Nawadikan people are able to prevent catastrophic fires that emit far more carbon into the atmosphere and are far more destructive. Yep. So it's quite incredible that by burning at the right times, you're actually able to prevent, these disasters. So the story was about that. It's about the incredible relationship they have with fire. And this is not just like the Nawadikan people. This is many different clan groups and family groups across the top end and arguably throughout the entire country had this very strong relationship with fire. It's sort of people have different opinions about what happened on the East Coast and the relationships there. But certainly we've lost that connection to country here, and we're not listening to the people that do.
Yep.
And so that's why we are. Well, that's one of the many reasons that we are experiencing, these terrible, fires. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you remember what month that ran in the magazine?
I don't. I think.
Anyway,
I don't. Sorry.
You should go and have a look. It's an amazing set of pictures. It's an amazing series. Yeah, fantastic. Judith, sorry, jump to your photo. Nick stole my fire a bit because I was going to get you to talk about the process of how you produce your images. So yeah, maybe you could just talk, more specific to this image.
Yeah. Well, this is probably the least involved of the three images that we're going to show. This one is called, with his mother lost to trucks, it was cold outside the pouch, cold and the night raining stars, Henry left the highway, following song lines across the Great Dividing Range to the sky country of kangaroos. I'm very interested in the natural processes that you don't necessarily see, and decomposition is one of them, but the beginning stages of decomposition. In some of the images that we'll show later, you'll see it a little bit more clearly, but as an animal begins to break down, a lot of the gases come out and a lot of the salts and things come out, and they all mark the page. But when you look at an animal, a fallen animal, what you're seeing is the result of this microsecond of light that has hit the animal and then has come back, imprinted on your retina, and your brain has interpreted that as an image. So you're actually seeing what you think is a still image, but it's only a microsecond flash of light. But what the page sees is however many hours you have that image there for. So you can put a pregnant frog on a page, and when 50 hours later, you'll see the eggs on the inside of the frog, which you can't see with the naked eye. And it's the same with the way that an animal begins to decompose. And there's some really interesting things about that when you look at it philosophically, because you begin to see that an image builds up of the animal around the animal. So there are all of these sort of mysteries that happen because of what occurs in the body when they begin to break down. So I started making this work because I felt that it's impossible to break down hierarchies and inequalities, the way that we treat each other, the way that we say some people's lives are worth more than other people's lives, while we still think that human lives are worth more than certain animals' lives, and then a dog's life is worth more than a praying mantis's life. And while we have this ladder of value that we place on life, it's impossible for us to value any kind of life, because all we're really doing is seeing hierarchies. We're seeing elitism. We're seeing the same kind of problems that have underpinned all of our societies. And so I wanted to take these little animals that nobody was going to notice, like stillborn kangaroos or snowy owls by the side of the road, and elevate them to give them the same kind of importance that you would do if you were doing a portrait of somebody that you loved who had passed away. So that's basically what's behind them. They all have little poems with them because I have to sit with them for 30 to 50 hours, which is a long time. So I write them little elegies and I give them names because it helps people feel this connection. But I think the coolest thing that's come out of it is that truck drivers have stopped, when I've been there by the side of the road with a dead animal and a bit of Perspex, because I put them in Perspex boxes to speed up the decomposition. And occasionally I've had truck drivers going, "What are you doing, love?" And then I tell them, and then sometimes they'll bring me back a rabbit. And then every now and then I've met one at the pub who's told me that he's driven a little bit slower on the road since seeing my pictures,
Wow.
Yeah, but he's not giving you any more stuff then. That's not helpful.
Believe me, there's enough.
Right.
They're quite. I actually find them really uplifting.
Yeah.
Like I look at that. There is like they're continuing to live, and for me, it's sort of like death is just a chemical process, in a lot of ways. I've found them really uplifting from the first time I discovered.
Yeah.
It was like Instagram was like, holy shit.
Yeah, yeah.
I showed them to my wife the other night, and she was just like, "Wow, these are beautiful."
Well, that's happened accidentally. Sometimes I do put constellations in them, but this one that's just happened accidentally as a product of the way that it was made. But it's interesting what you say, Nick, because we've been scammed on this subject of death. We really have in the West. We've been scammed because we've been cut off from death. You know, unless you're sort of, you know, SES or first responder, most people go through their whole lives without being faced with death, and we're not allowed to have the privilege of preparing our loved ones for death anymore. And as a result, it creates this unknown, and we all fill that unknown with horror stories, because that's just what you do, right? The things you don't know are always scarier. But if you sit with an animal, you know, and you pull it off the road and you sit with it, and it doesn't take long, and the animal bloats up, and then gases come out, and then it goes back down, and then it begins to break down like an autumn leaf. And it's not horrific. There is no point where you're looking at that animal where you think, this is so horrific, you know, this is a horror show. It just isn't. It's very gentle. The country takes that animal back into itself in this very maternal way, and you realise that we've been kept in this state of fear because of our society. Our society has made us afraid, because we're easier to control when we're afraid. We're afraid of everything, which means we hold on to our security, and we're easier to manipulate.
This is not to say everybody should sit on the roads from now on.
Okay, we'll move on a bit. So photography is probably one of the most powerful mediums we can use to report, not just on a global scale, but just as importantly on a local level, the changes we see in our own climate as a result of global warming and climate change. Can I ask each of you to talk about some of the different events or projects that you have worked on? I'm going to start with Nick again. I brought up the flood picture, which is from the same area as the dust picture before.
It is. It's only about 20 kilometres away, which I kind of wanted to... A couple of different reasons, as in, you know, we hear about you know, droughts and flooding rains and stuff like that, but it's been the bang, 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 bang. So these guys have just essentially, the region around Forbes, have essentially just been in one form of natural disaster for the past close to a decade now, and then you have a little break and then you're back into the millennium drought. These guys had like epic desert, and then almost straight into floods. And at this time, which was in last year, about this time last year actually, they had just had four major flood events go through the town in the space of a month, when they hadn't had one for like years and years and years and years. And so this is with a drone, which is actually, you know, technology can be a bit, you know, what do you call it, just a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. But drones have made like for floods especially, made images that normally you'd only be able to get with helicopters. And so you suddenly can really understand the scale of how much water, and sometimes it's really hard to actually, at ground level, show that width and you know, how much water. So this is just south of Forbes. This road, I mean, for a, I guess a state library perspective, and I mean, actually I'm going to expand out here and really get going. Climate change through photography is shown not through single images, but through broad, long bodies of work, and often with multiple people, and being able to align it with major events, and then together all those bodies of, like a scientific piece of work is not with one little anomalous thing. It's, you know, ice samples that are taken over hundreds of years. I've gone off so far now, I've lost my point.
Climate change long term.
Yeah. Anyway, it's heaps good picture. No. So I've got to, for an institution like the State Library, there's actually a lot of information in a place like this. So a person who's well versed in transport would look at that and not be going, oh, that's a lot of water. They go, oh my God, those trucks are going to be tearing up that road. So you start imagining how many, this is how I started to smack some heads in our office, is when I started translating it into money. It's like, okay, this road has been repaired 4 times in a month. How many millions of dollars is that? And that's just here. And there was like all of our internal rivers were all flooding at that time at major points. And so the amount of money, I think in the end this is, the 2022 floods were the most expensive natural disaster in Australia. So. And it's sort of like, well, you know, but it was going kind of untold because it's not as flamey. But for me, actually, I find floods like one of the most challenging. You know, getting bitten and insects and yuckiness. You don't know where you're walking. I mean, we've all done that. It's just, you know, sewage and horribleness. And,
Yep.
and you just can't get there.
Yeah. I remember covering floods up in Cairns, and you know, you're wading in water, knowing that there's probably crocodiles floating around. It's just like,
I didn't think about that there, but yeah.
Next level.
And it's heaps more environmentally responsible too to use a drone than hire a helicopter.
I didn't think of that advantage.
Okay, we're going to move on to another of Judith's images, another stunning image. I'll get you to talk about this. Just maybe your work draws on your connection to the land and also what's above, the stars and galaxies, which I believe we can see here.
Yeah.
So can I get you to talk about those connections and how they influence your work?
Well, this is called Zoe Descends to Comfort Her Daughters in a Burning Country. When I made this work, we had fire 9 kilometres from my house, and I had been sleeping in the car at my friend's house, and she had fire on 4 fronts. And we'd been sleeping in the wool shed with gas masks, and long after all the roads were closed and there was no way out. And there was hardly any UV, so for someone who's trying to make work with photographic paper, having hardly any UV is really bad. Everything develops really slowly. And I found this little smoke-exhausted brown snake who died in the end from smoke inhalation. And this was around the time Philip Blenkinsop decided to come out to swan in from France and then take photographs of the fire. The fires were almost out by this stage. And so he sat down with us, and I got a sheet.
Thank goodness, actually, because he would have got better pictures than us.
I know, but it was good that he didn't manage it. I sat down with him, and we mapped the night sky exactly as it was, all of the constellations on that night as they would have appeared in the sky. We couldn't see them because of the bushfire smoke. So we mapped what we would have seen, and then I made them with seeds, gluing the seeds with honey onto a piece of glass. And then where there were red giants, I put a blob of copper chloride to try and make it go red, although 1 or 2 went a little bit green when they were supposed to go red, because you never know with copper chloride. And then put the glass down over the top of the smoke-exhausted, by this stage dead snake, and put him where the Milky Way would be. And so in a way, this was a kind of hope, because at this point, you know, we just didn't know where this was going. It was before COVID, so it was this massive catastrophe. We literally couldn't see. We could almost not see each other from where we were in the smoke at that time. We didn't know whether we would wake up in the morning and everything would be gone or not. And, you know, I would have given anything just to see the stars. So that's what we ended up making. It took ages to develop because the UV meant it was really, really slow. So it ended up taking about 70 hours to develop.
It's actually a really great way to discover how light works when you really slow it down and bring the chemistry back into it and stuff. And like, it hadn't even occurred to me that, there's no UV and just some of that. Yeah, it's a great way. Like, I like to teach young photographers, do time exposures, like allow that light to have a bit of, festering in your camera. Yeah.
Yeah, and then you can see it as you go. You've got time to change things and fix things. You don't need, a lot of Photoshop, because if you don't like the way it looks, you just change it and then wait an hour.
Yeah, stunning. Love it. And Matt, we're going to move to your picture here of the orange dust. I'll get you to talk a bit about this.
Yeah, okay. So I wanted to show this image because it's I guess it's like sort of the direction I'm looking into. I'm very interested in this idea about environmental disasters and the causes behind them, and then looking at this idea of the political sort of relationship between coal in this country and other you know, sort of carbon emitters. And so this image was taken on assignment actually in the Galilee Basin at this sort of, that everyone probably knows Adani, the Adani coal mine. Yep. And so, yeah, so I went up there and was hanging out with these traditional owners who had set up like a protest camp that was only about like 300 or 400 meters from the main site. And as soon as we arrived there, we had security like on us like a rash. They were driving past with these cameras that were able to like pick us up, and then they used these images to basically identify us, figure out who we were. So within a few hours, we had a letter from them, like a cease and desist letter, so that if we publish any material, that they would sue for damages. That was their sort of their line. So quite intimidating as a journalist working in that kind of environment. And Adani themselves are known to be quite litigious. They've fired, sorry, not fired, they've gone after several people. It's not like an empty threat, it's a real threat. So anyway, that is the sort of the dynamics or the atmosphere at the time. And while I was sort of working there, we heard this just a mighty explosion. And every day they would actually clear more land, and they would set up these massive dust clouds that were sort of, you know, the locals believed were quite toxic. And so I immediately heard this explosion, ran for the drone, put it up, and just flew as fast as I could to get this image. And it's probably, one of the strongest from that series, because, you know, these sites are so hard to photograph and to see. You know, the mine itself is in private property and is a long way away from any public access. So unless you chartered a plane, you know, you're never actually going to be able to see down into these you know, massive mines. Yep. So I'm really interested by this idea that drones now have the potential to change all that and to be able to see these things and show people actually what's going on at these sites. But anyway, just to also explain, this image is actually a photograph or a scan of a PDF document and that was tabled into Parliament by Senator Pocock because of the threats, the legal threats. It meant that I wasn't allowed to publish the image, but because it was tabled in Parliament and then re-photographed, it can now be seen in this form.
Right, okay. I was going to say, because your exposure was pretty poor. It's an incredible image.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. We'll move along. Sticking with the impact photography has in terms of education and helping better understand the effects we are experiencing, can I get each of you to talk about the reach your images have had locally, nationally and globally? Because I have no doubt, you know, all your images are reaching and having impact on many people in many different ways. I'm going to start with one of Matt's pictures, which is the kangaroo and the bushfires. I'm sure you've all seen this picture.
Best cardboard cutout ever, eh?
So Matt, like I said, I'm sure everybody, or most people have seen this. It was run globally across front pages of newspapers. It went viral at the time online. So yeah, do you want to talk to us a bit about this?
Yeah. I mean, everyone who does photography long enough knows that, you know, there is luck involved in photography. You know, obviously it's about being prepared, doing the hard yards, being in the action. The amount of work that we put in to get images like this is, you know, we all know it's huge. And you know, the actual sort of circumstances around the image itself is quite ordinary. I was, well, actually, that's not true at all.
It's kind of hyper-ordinary, yeah.
No, that's not true. It was an absolutely catastrophic situation in Lake Conjola. Yep. At the time. And, well, that morning we spoke, and Nick was down there. Nick has been incredibly generous in providing information for many photographers, I'm sure.
All of us.
All of us, yeah.
All of us.
And Nick was saying, like, you've got to get down south, you've got to get down to Cobargo. I was on summer holiday with my family, and my fiance at the time was pissed that I'd been out photographing so many fires, so I couldn't leave early enough to get down to Cobargo. But that day, it just felt like everything was just going off, and I was driving down to
This
south.
is New Year's Eve.
So New Year's Eve, and driving down south, and I just see this massive smoke plume at 10 a.m., which is serious. Like, you normally would see something, this kind of activity. The smoke plume was as such that it was like it had already taken on its own systems, and it was just ripping through. So another thing that Nick told me early on, as he was sort of educating me on how to photograph these fires safely and properly, was that if you see a fire, you stick with it. You know, you don't try to find another fire. You know, you think, well, I'll stick here, and I waited, and basically I waited on this side of the road, and the fire sort of ripped through, and it went down into Conjola, and so I just sort of followed it in, and I ended up being the only photographer there that day. I saw like one RFS truck that was sort of just basically just not operating, and it was just catastrophic. Over 150 homes were burnt. Yep. People were sheltering at the beach. Thousands were cut off, you know, just in that town alone. And this image was in the middle of Conjola, where actually the houses in that part had mostly survived, but it was burning, and then all of a sudden, these kangaroos just darted out in front of me. And so it was just responding really to that happening, yeah.
So this is some of the runs that Matt got with that picture globally.
Yeah, so I lost track of it, obviously, but I just put this up here because I thought, for me, I've never had an image that's been so widely seen, and it is interesting that, it takes on life on its own. You know, it turns into like people. You can see some people have like made paintings of it. They made like tattoos of it, and people still send me things all randomly. So yeah, it's quite nice to see this.
It was the quintessential though international news image. It's like you look at it, you know exactly where it is and what's happening. It's like
I think often it's actually like I think you'd agree with this. Like it's like simple images that are very easy to read quickly. Can have that. They could be so. It's not it's not a complex image, but it has that kind of like instant like, oh shit, fire, kangaroos, Australia, and so I think that's probably why it ended up being successful.
There's also interesting side story to that. So Greg Mullins, you guys, he was the former Fire and Rescue Commissioner. Now he's a RFS. He's actually one of my bosses in RFS. Anyway, he wrote a book called Firestorm. He must have stole the idea from me. But anyway, he wrote about that day. A close friend of his was in Lake Conjola as well, and had been complaining about a guy dressed up in RFS uniform taking pictures. But there's still this. It's actually a incredibly lonely and often abused place, being a photographer, even though the RFS badly want us out there, love us out there. It's a lonely place to be. And the misunderstanding from people, it's like, why aren't you saving houses? It's like, well, it's not my job. It's your job. So it's a hard day, especially when you're by yourself.
Yeah, I mean, but working by yourself in this kind of environment, incredibly dangerous. You're the whole time you're thinking about, what can kill me or what can fall down on top of my head. You drink enough water, because if you have a heat stroke, no one's going to save you.
Yep.
And then
they might get a photo though.
And then as I went down to see these people sheltering, by far and away, most of them were cool, but there were people yelling at me, like, why are you taking photographs? And it's like, hang on a second. Like, if you don't see these events recorded, the amount of like risk we take, the amount of effort we take.
I usually just like go, I don't know. There's something around that's going on at the moment that maybe it's worth a photo.
Yeah, I think it's discouraging sometimes because I don't think people realise that is how it's done. Yeah. That is how we understand our world, by these images, by this vision. It's how we collect news. And if it wasn't for that, I mean, it's almost like people don't realise how these images are made, and it can be confronting for sure.
Well, you have a look at the direct comparison to Black Saturday, where there were very few photographers out, there's actually hardly any vision. The only stuff that you actually, like there were multiple fire tornadoes on that day. There's hardly anything. So the scientists are left there, and fire behaviourists are left there kind of going, we think this happened, we think. When you've got videos and stills from people who know what they're doing on the ground, as well as from the firefighters on the ground, you're able to go, this is what was going on, this is what happened here, and start to understand really what in the world's going on in your environment on that day.
Yeah.
There was huge hostility towards photographers in my region taking photos during the fires. In fact, out the back of Namadgi, there are a couple of photographers that were attacked by people. Yeah, wow. Because in that moment, I think people are looking for somebody to blame, but there's also that question about, is it voyeurism or is it photography? And you don't really have time to have the conversation about, and hand someone your CV, you know, I really am a proper photographer, I'm not just...
Well, I think it was after the Black Summer fires that, because of the media coverage, that fundraising efforts were way above anything else before.
Yeah.
When it came to, you know, people donating.
Yeah, millions and millions of dollars.
Yeah. And it's because of this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to move on to Judith's last picture that we're going to see today.
Yeah, this is a little stillborn wombat.
It is a wombat.
It's a wombat. Sort of, he was very early. It's called Beside the King's Highway. Adam crosses over, leaving his mother's pouch, the lights of the city-bound cars, snow gums dark in winter, and the night will take him back. And what was
rolls off the tongue, doesn't it?
Just, yeah. I mean, I like these really short, pithy titles. Yeah. But, you know, out where I live, there's a lot of roadkill, and a lot of those are wombats. And the first thing that you have to do is check the pouch. And, you know, in this case, we got this wombat off the road and realised that there was a baby sort of almost in the pouch. So we delivered this baby in the hope that it would survive. And it did survive for a couple of seconds, and then it didn't survive. And it just, you know, between where I lived at the time and Lake George, at one stage there were 50 of these dead wombats with crosses on them because the pouches had been checked, and it just became pretty demoralising. And I felt so sad for this little wombat. I thought, I'm not just going to do a normal print. So this is an 8-month exposure.
Whoa.
It was supposed to be a 6-month exposure, but I got carried away.
Imagine the photo desk onto you. Well, it'll be a while yet.
It's going to take a while, yeah. So all I did with him was, as he was, I placed him on photographic paper with a Perspex cover, because I knew that as, you know, he began to break down, if I kept Perspex over so there was no air in there at all, then first of all the salts would come out of him because of the condensation, and secondly, he'd mummify. So he actually mummified. But the real surprise for me, 8 months afterwards, was that when I took him off, the way that the salt had happened, it created what looked like this little wing you can see coming out the top. That's just the salt that's come out of him by himself. And then around him, you can see that there's this shape, this sort of ephemeral shape. Now, there's something that really amazing that happens with animals and birds. It happens to a lesser extent with reptiles, but it does not happen with a seed pod or a rock or anything like that. And that is over very long exposures. It creates this little sort of ghost image around them. And for a long time, I thought it would be just the gases and things that come out of them. But the gases are gone in a very short period of time. And so sometimes I'll get an animal that doesn't have any gases left in it, and it will still create this sort of extra ghostly shape around it, only for a certain time. Once they become dry, it doesn't do that anymore. But you can see he's got one little claw down the bottom that was fully formed, and then, yeah, his ribs. And he was actually a little bit fatter when I put him on the page, and then as he mummified, he became littler, and you could see all the bones. And you can see that there are these golds and things that come out as well in him. There's a really interesting thing that happens with colour, and I don't understand it at all. I've been trying to work a little bit with some of the people working in forensic science to work out what it's all about, but sometimes there are these gold things that happen. If an animal has died with a lot of stress, like an accident, it'll end up with big gold blobs, and sometimes with the little unborn things. They'll end up with gold on them too. But I really have no idea about most of how these images are made. I just sort of choreograph them in a way, and then it's as though the animal with its own chemistry creates its own image of itself. But, you know, I think what I really wanted to show with all of these images is that these little creatures, they're all sort of microcosms, you know, in the same way that a human being is. You can look at a human being, particularly one that you're really attached to, and particularly when you fear that you're going to lose them, and you can see that there's something miraculous about a living, talking, breathing entity. But you sort of, your gaze can pass over a bird or you know, a frog or something like that. But if you can see that sort of miracle in them, then, you know, hopefully, if you can show enough people images like that, you might galvanise people to try and protect the ones that we've got, so they don't all have to be post-mortem.
Yeah. Beautiful. And we're going to move to Nick's last picture, which is, again, this was one of the most powerful images from the 2019-2020 Black Summer fires.
So Matt and I and Dean Sewell were actually all at this. We all got pictures of it. It was even I am like, I've not seen an event like that happen. So I've seen big flames and lots of stuff going off, but essentially I've set the scene. The Greenbottle Creek fire had been bumbling around in the Blue Mountains. It finally jumped over the Warragamba Dam catchment and came into north of Oakdale. And it's, you know, blasted its way up into the back of Orangeville. But it had really kind of just sort of calmed down, settled down. We were tootling around at the back of this well-defendable house. I think it had a tennis court, and it's quite a wealthy sort of house. But probably about 50 to 100 metres of kind of very dry grass. Yep. And on the edge of this bush, and we're just sort of standing there with some fire and rescue guys. It's about 1/2 metre flame height, in about 50 metres in, and it had been like that for about half an hour, wasn't it?
About to go home, I think.
Yeah, it was like pretty quiet, and there wasn't even really a change of wind. I've gone back and had a look at the radar for that time, and there was a very weak southerly came through, and I think it's just moved the plume out of the way and allowed some of this like oxygen to come in at the right place, and it just created a critical moment. And it's bizarre because it's burned against the wind. Like I've gone back and done super nerd stuff and looking at where it's all going. It's rotating the wrong way, so it's freaking me out. Essentially, like this thing's gone from 1/2 metre height and in about 5 seconds has gone to 100 metre flames. I mean, this is when it's calming down. If you get a fire whirl like that, you're talking at like the wind speeds in that would be hundreds of kilometres an hour. And it's like it's just trying to find the most efficient way of pumping hot air up as quickly as it can, and that's how it's trying to do it. And it's ripping that way. It goes off and consumes. I'm so annoyed that I was like 2 seconds too late to get the guy getting in the truck.
Oh, yeah.
But he's like so calm, he says, yeah, it's a bit hot.
One guy stay behind.
Yeah, might move the truck.
We ran, so we were at this truck, and about 20 of us just ran for our lives.
There's about 3 or 4 firefighters and me, you and Dean, and there are a couple more down there. And it's about as close to just a violent explosion as you can get. And the heat it wasn't about you had no choice. It was stuff was just, in some of the frames of other moments, you actually see, it's called pyrolysing. The gases are just coming out of this dry grass. It's just going like that and just igniting. It was like, later on we're like, well, that was new. That was an experience. And even the firefighters were like, so they're all there with their phones going, oh yeah, and they, fuck. Pull back, fuck, and then it's like, woohoo, because they're kind of freaks. I mean, the thing is, you'll find about firefighters and people ask that we do it, it's like, oh, serious. Oh my God, what was that? That was pretty wild. It was, a moment. But it was also like right on deadline. And I'm like, I've never in my career actually got to go, hold the front. But unfortunately, they went, well, fortunately for Walter Peters and Jeremy Piper, because they were up in...
They went with another image.
Well, they'd already, the page had already gone. So that same night, Jeremy and Walter were up at the Gospers Mountain fire had turned into what's called the 3 Mile Fire up near Mangrove Mountain, and it had come ripping out with, you know, all that sort of stuff, and they were like really happy with their pictures, and then we bang up with these. Yeah.
Speaking of deadlines, we're at 7 o'clock. Have we got time for a couple of questions? Yeah. So we were planning to have a 15-minute Q&A, but these guys talk too much, so run out a bit of time. But there is a microphone over here at the bottom of the stairs if anybody does have questions for the panel.
No questions?
Yeah.
No questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you ever get, you see death and does it, dying, and does, how, your emotion, how do you feel sad, do you feel happy, do you feel appeased? And then you guys who have loved ones, when you put yourself at risk, what are your personal feelings in this situation?
You start?
In the beginning, I felt very sad for all of those animals, you know, and I started making this in some way to work out how to deal with the grief of losing humans, because I thought to myself, if I understood death a little bit more, I might understand grief a little bit more, and I might not be so completely bowled over by it when it arrives. But actually, beginning to make these works, I've started to feel quite joyful. Because I'm starting to see death differently. Death is not a terminus, and the way that we think about death is that life goes and then it stops, but it actually doesn't. And you know, we all get gaslit by scientists going, well, the physical sciences say that death is the end. Well, that's bullshit. The physical sciences say no such thing, because if you actually look at what happens in front of your face, you can see that this change occurs that can go for 8 months. I could have done that for longer, and there would have been more change that happens until all of the physical remnants are no longer something that I personally can sense. But that change just continues. And for me, that felt like something that I could put faith in. I didn't have to put faith in a deity or in, you know, crystal healing or hope or any of those other things that I'm too cynical to put any faith in. I could put faith in the fact that I could see this thing in front of me happening that was peaceful and transcendent and real and deeply connected to the land that I was standing on. You know, I had this mate, and he was 113 years old when he died. And one time I went to church.
113?
He was 113. He was the last surviving eyewitness of the Coniston massacre. He was a Welpry bloke. And I went to church with him once, and he cracked up laughing twice. The first time was when they were talking about the Garden of Eden, because he reckons that if Eve had been Welpry, she would have eaten the snake. The apple anyway, right? That was the first one. But the second one, he just couldn't understand why people were inside a church praying to an imaginary God instead of being outside. And he said, it's like if you've got a cat and there's all these fleas on the cat, and they're all running around building churches, and they're going into the churches and they're praying because they're looking for cat, and they're just standing on him. And you know, at the end of all of these 6 years of work, that's just the conclusion that I've come to, that the answer is under our feet. And if you watch what really happens, and you watch really closely what happens, you don't need the invented things, you know, because all those answers are there on the ground.
As far as yeah, well, I've had several unsuccessful relationships. And there's no doubt that that it has some impact on it. It requires a very understanding partner, and you push it and push it. And like literally, my partner last night goes, "Which do you like more, the RFS or me?" And I was like, kind of depends what day and like what mood you're in. So last night it was the RFS. Some days it's not. I mean, the thing is, I mean, we don't do things dumb. We are constantly making, you know, it can be dangerous crossing the road. Like, we're constantly assessing our safety zones and what the best idea, and sometimes you just can't get into the right place. It's rare that we'll be taking photographs in a place where there are no other people or no RFS, or you're asking for trouble in those times. So, you know, we're utmost in our mind is, you know, all those pictures we missed because we thought we might die. So, I mean, we take that into account all the time. So we like to make it out that it's super dangerous, but it's not that bad.
True.
I mean, like, there is damage that you don't actually realise you get at the time. Like, Matt's like sustained some pretty nasty coughing and like, you know, some of the stuff that we were breathing in. There's more and more study coming into, you know, any smoke is bad, and we've all sucked down a lot of smoke, of various kinds. But yeah.
Yeah.
Come on, Dino, I know. I've got the photos. But anyway, that's probably the real danger, is what we've been breathing in over those years. You know, how many Canberra, you know, how many homes you're wandering around without anything on your face, and yeah.
I would just add that to your question as well, that like there is an emotional toll in covering these events, and what I found interesting about covering the Black Summer fires was that I couldn't put my finger on what exactly. I was very emotional after those fires. I told you this, and Nick told me I was soft, but I was emotional, and I couldn't really put my finger on like what it was about, why. Because in the past, I have done work, you know, covering the Civil War in South Sudan, seeing children die from starvation and other things, and that's a very like, you know, terrible thing to see, and it's very clear as to why you know that's a confronting situation to be in. But for me, the fires was just like, there was not one moment, there was not one thing, it was just this collective kind of grief, I guess, for witnessing these places just absolutely destroyed. Places that we, you know, grown up as a kid and on holidays, and and maybe knowing the numbers, the toll on animals.
That's the big one. It was like also just knowing, because of political stuff that had been going on, that we were losing stuff that we didn't even know was there. Yeah. And there was stuff that was burning that. This was some of the different stuff. There was stuff that was burning that shouldn't be burning. And that was deeply demoralising.
Yeah.
See, we're not heartless.
I remember
just that we take a photo of it when it's happening.
I remember driving back down the south coast about 3 months after the Black Summer fires and going through all the burnout areas and just getting quite emotional about what you're seeing. Like, you know, when you're there covering it, it's just you go, but to go back into the blackness, and it was quite confronting.
Yeah, you're soft too.
And following up, just one more thing, is following up with the people that have lost everything, and seeing that shift, because we all did this, and as it's happening, people are just adrenaline, and you know, I met people that lost their homes, but they're like having a beer and having a laugh, and they're in this like funny phase. But I continue to go back, and several of us as well, and you see the process of coming to terms with it, and it's not pretty, you know. It's
and still going.
And still going. Yeah, they say
what happened. Like straight after 2020 fires, we had COVID, and so bang straight into next disaster, and then bang straight into flood disasters.
It's a lot of trauma, a lot of slow recovery, coming to terms with what happened, I think, for a lot of people.
And also
it's important to tell these stories as well, and to keep photographing them and returning to them.
The challenge is also, and I don't blame the public, there's only so much pain and suffering you can handle. You've like, I've had to turn off from international news. It's just like, blah, 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 I'm just going to concentrate on fires. It's just like, there's only so much, you know, overload.
Okay, we might wrap it up there. Thank you, guys.
Pleasure, Treasure.
Thank you.